This is the Proflo Edgehill toilet, one of the many few residential toilets Proflo makes. 2012 was the year that Proflo started making their own fixtures. Originally, they just started out reselling Briggs fixtures under their own brand and making them worse in the process. But 2012 was the year they finally started making their own toilets. The most known one being the Proflo Jerritt. They also made the Calhoun and eventually introduced the Edgehill around the same timeline. Their residential toilets are known for being complete crap, but this is easily their worst, and we're going to see why. Let's take a look at the overall design. As you can tell, it is painfully generic, especially the bowl. Trackway passages are also painfully generic. If you've seen a generic toilet, you've probably seen that trackway passage before. Although the tank is a little bit different. While I'm not a big fan of how it's designed, it still has this cheap look to it. I do like what they were going for with this, with the corner flushing handle. And it definitely looks a lot nicer than the Jerritt, which just looks ridiculously cheap and crappy. The trackway opening is painfully generic. You've probably seen this even on something that wasn't a Proflo like this. But I think the worst part is the fact the rim jets are pointed down. This seems to be a common problem with a lot of modern toilets, how the rim jets are pointed down and not angled, and therefore the ball rinse is pretty bad. I mean, just outright terrible. Especially with this. As you move inside the tank, you might notice two different things. One, of course, is the cheap, crappy parts that these come with. These are the original parts. A lot of generic toilets tend to come with this kind of crap too, which is not very great. But you might notice something else. The water line. It's actually pretty low. You see all this space that's not being used. And that's because Proflo was kind of going with the ideal of making this exclusively 1.28 gallons, as shown here. I believe there is a 1.6 gallon version, but this tends to be a lot more dominant, so this is the one we'll be kind of basing it on. But as you can see there, unless you get a new base, you're basically devoted to 1.28 gallons pretty much. There's no really way to extend the flush unless you modify it, which is pretty sucky. Let's take a look at a flush. Unsurprisingly, the flush is terrible. Now, I know this is kind of pointless, but let's hold the handle down and see what happens. The extended flush doesn't really do much, as you saw there. I think the biggest problem with this is the fact that the regurgitation is insane. Also the fact that the flush itself is kind of on the weaker side, like most generic toilets. Another thing about this is the fact that the performance is also not good. I mean, you really shouldn't be surprised about that. Take a look at the passages. They are about as painfully generic as you'll get, and I've seen a lot of toilets with that passageway clog quite frequently, and unfortunately this is no different. Not helping is the fact that you're pretty much restricted on this water level, so you can't really extend the flush, so eventually you're not getting everything down efficiently, so it can sometimes cause backups, which also is not good. There's a reason I like that some toilets often include extra water so you can actually utilize, but this toilet really does not do that. Now, let's see how terrible the bowl rinse is. In fact, you may have barely even saw it at all. But as you saw, since the rim jets are pointed down, the bowl rinse is pretty crap. Not only are you missing key areas, but It's just not very covered enough. There's a reason I prefer the angled rim jets, and unfortunately this does not have it, just like most modern toilets, unfortunately. And that is the Proflo Edgehill toilet. A pretty terrible toilet, but a lot of Proflo toilets are generally crap. But honestly, I think this is easily the worst one. But let's grade it. Beginning with the overall design, I do not like it. To be completely fair though, it definitely looks a lot better than the Proflo Jerritt, but it still definitely has a hint of cheapness to its design, especially with the bowl design. I do like what they try to do with the tank, but honestly the finished product is just not great. I give the design a 4. The tank parts are cheap and crappy. Like, they're serviceable for a short period of time, but eventually you'll need to replace them as they're so cheap and very flimsy. You can definitely tell these definitely did not get the best parts, but that's typical for most generic toilets like this. The parts get a 3. Are you shocked the quality control is horrible? No? Me neither. Considering this is a pretty cheap toilet, it's very poorly made, with poor designs of the rim, with poor design of the trapway itself. Everything about this generic toilet just doesn't work at all, or to a bare minimum at most, but that's about it. Quality control gets a 2. The trapway is painfully generic. If you've seen a generic toilet before, you've definitely seen them all, and this is no different. The passages and opening are not the greatest design, and therefore it gets a 4. Oh wow, the flush sucks. I totally did not see this coming from a generic toilet. No, not at all. Obviously you know where I'm going with this. The flush gets a 2. Given the fact that you're kind of restricted to a shorter water level, and you really have to modify the tank in order to get more water out of it, while the siphon is pretty strong looking, it's very short and very crappy. Therefore, some things could get left behind a little bit more compared to something like the Jerritt or even the Calhoun. The pull and siphon get a 3 due to that fact. Performance shouldn't be very shocking, it's very crappy. But are you really shocked that a poorly designed toilet like this has a very crappy performance? No, you shouldn't. I'll say some of the other Proflo toilets perform a little bit better compared to this, but not by that much. But at the same time, could have been executed a lot worse. Still crap. It gets a 3. The ball rinse is easily the worst part of this toilet. It is just awful. Which isn't completely shocking considering the jets are pointed down and don't cover a lot of the bowl. Therefore, it leaves a lot of stains behind everywhere in the bowl. The bowl rinse is easily a 1. With all the facts I just mentioned, you shouldn't be surprised that the survivability sucks. In fact, I see this thing getting replaced a lot more compared to any other Proflo toilet ever made. Yes, even the Gilpin. That being said, survivability is a 2. Now we'll talk about the overall value, or why there is no value to this toilet. As with most generic toilets, it sucks. But I think this is easily the worst Proflo toilet ever made in terms of residential toilets. Everything about this design just screams poorly done and very cheap. From the pitiful flush, to the pitiful performance, to the absolutely god-awful bowl rinse, there is nothing special about this toilet at all. It's another cheap piece of garbage that's just thrown into the mix just for the sake of making sales and throwing people off. I would never, ever recommend buying this toilet, as they do still make this toilet to this very day. If you have to buy a Proflo toilet, some of the other options are better, in quotations. That being said though, most Proflo toilets suck, but this is easily Proflo's worst toilet. There is no value to this toilet, and it gets a 1. And the final score of the Proflo Edgehill toilet is a 25 out of 100. I can go on and on about how awful this toilet is, but I'd be wasting my time. Proflo makes a lot of garbage in general, but this is easily their worst one yet. I can at least find some excuses about the Gilpin are slightly better than us, even though that toilet is also awful. But at the end of the day, I cannot recommend you enough to stay away from this toilet. There is absolutely no reason to buy this. There are better, cheaper options out there, even though a majority of them suck, but I can make a case for most other toilets compared to this. That much I'll say.